The Emperor united humanity. His legions conquered the stars. The Imperium was in a golden age. But peace, that was never part of our future. 9 full legions of the Adeptus Astartes, fully half of the Imperium's forces, are about to rebel against the ruler of humanity, and a conflict lasting over a decade will break the galaxy while the cruel gods of the warp laugh and feast on souls. There is no story in the Warhammer 40k setting that is more iconic or important than this. So get yourself some snacks and a good place to sit, because this is the entire Horus Heresy timeline explained. Breaking a galaxy-spanning army of hardened and loyal soldiers takes more than just a single event, and when we look over the causes of the Horus Heresy, we do see several points of weakness and mistakes that contributed, events that were both spontaneous and also shaped by careful manipulation. And no one did more of this work than Erebus of the Wordbearers. First Chaplain Erebus of the Wordbearers has been a manipulative snake of a man since he was young. Erebus isn't even his true name, and while he's not a Primarch, the first Chaplain was a follower of the Chaos Gods long before he met Lorgar Aurelian, and he did more to advance their plans than almost anyone else in this story. But even Erebus wasn't as effective at alienating the Primarchs as the Emperor himself. Early on, Big E had lots of time to spend on his recovered sons. Horus got a few decades alone with him, as did Vulcan, but as time went on, it was clear that the Emperor had some sort of pressure, and he was starting to spend less and less time pretending that the Primarchs were people. Some, like Conrad Kurz and Angron, were deeply damaged from the start. Kurz haunted by visions of death, Angron mangled by the butcher's nails. Other Primarchs found later in the Crusade, like Mortarion, were just given much less attention. Aside from neglect, there is a clear pattern of the Emperor not explaining things to his sons when it would have been very helpful for them to know. So here's where we'll circle back to figuring out what the definitive start of the Horus Heresy was. And for us, that has to be Monarchia. The Wordbearers Legion had been scolded more than once about how slowly they conquered planets. This slowdown was because leading elements of the Legion, people like Erebus, Corpheron, and Lorgar himself, insisted on building shrines and monuments to the Emperor as the god of humanity before moving on to the next world. Now, Big E didn't tell Lorgar why this was a bad idea. He just said it was against his wishes and expected that his most faithful son would stop worshipping him. Then the Wordbearers created Monarchia, their perfect city, filled with beautiful cathedrals and statues and populated with the most devout worshippers of the Master of Mankind. It was a step too far, and the Emperor finally had enough. In 964 M30, he orders the Ultramarines to level the place and makes the entire Wordbearers Legion kneel in the ashes of their perfect city, rededicating themselves to the atheist principles of the Great Crusade. And it's here that Erebus saw his chance to convince Lorgar that the Emperor was a false god, that there were older and more worthy beings to worship. The depressed Primarch took very little convincing, and from then on, the events of the Horus Heresy were inevitable. Now that the forces of chaos had a foothold in the galaxy with Lorgar and his loyal Wordbearers, all they had to do was find the right opportunities to turn more Primarchs. Changing loyalty is a difficult prospect with regular humans, but the Primarchs were super intelligent demigods, and so it would take some very destabilizing events to drive that wedge between the Emperor and some of his sons. As usual, the Emperor kept his sons in the dark about chaos, about his grand designs, about everything. That silence wore on them, and doubt began to take root between the Emperor and his sons, but also between each other. The first big shift was Ulanor. In the first year of M31, at the end of a truly massive campaign to rid the galaxy of the largest Orc empire ever seen, the Emperor announced that he was quitting the Great Crusade. He had personally fought and bled with his sons and their Astartes legions for over 300 years at this point, but other projects demanded his attention, and so it was time for him to leave the Crusade in the hands of his sons, specifically Horus, the greatest of the Primarchs, who was named War Master and given complete control over the final stages of the campaign to conquer what remained of the galaxy. Making Horus War Master was already a political nightmare. Horus was well regarded amongst his brother Primarchs and was widely believed to be the very best of them overall, but we're talking about superhuman demigods here. Best was always a relative term. Even Horus was doubtful that he was the right choice, with him and several of the other Primarchs thinking that Sanguinius should have been made the War Master. Again, it would have been smart here for the Emperor to have told his Primarchs that he was focusing on his Webway project back on Terra, using the Golden Throne to wedge open an apparently abandoned section of an Eldari Webway so that humanity could stop using the warp altogether, cutting even more of the Chaos God's influence out of the galaxy. But he didn't, and many of the Primarchs began to believe, just like the Thunder Warriors, the Emperor was preparing for the next phase of his plans for humanity, and it didn't include them. Without more guidance than warp creatures bad, the Crusade forces had to keep making cover-up stories whenever they ran into strange warp entities or sorcery, since the Primarchs knew just enough to understand that the Emperor didn't want people knowing about these things. But that ignorance meant that corruption was slowly spreading. At the same time Ulanor was finishing up, the cleansing of Laren had begun, and Fulgrim took a demon-forged sword as a trophy without understanding the dangers of keeping a demon strapped to his waist at all times. Not long after that, Magnus would be called to the world of Nicaea to argue for his librarian program, an experiment that trained the hardened warriors of the Astartes legions to use psychic powers for the good of humanity. Once again, it would have been a great idea for the Emperor to explain to his children that the warp was dangerous because of the horrible eldritch creatures that live there, and to his credit, he actually had told Magnus this, although not much more than that, which had already resulted in the Thousand Sons Primarch making some secret deals with warp creatures he had no idea were laying a trap for him. However, because many of the Primarchs only knew that sorcery was dangerous, the trial went badly, and the Psychic Marines had to give up their practice and become average line officers again, and Magnus had to stop poking at the warp. So that obviously didn't work, but it did set up a whole new tricky area of law that basically forced Magnus to be a criminal if he wanted to fulfill his purpose. More on that later, but this is getting more complex because as time went on, the civilians of the Imperium were starting to have a voice. The Council of Terra, mortal bureaucrats who managed the Imperium's daily affairs, were suddenly handed authority over the worlds the legions had bled to conquer. At the Emperor's command, fleets of artists and remembrancers were sent to document each campaign. But worse still, accountants followed behind, bringing news of taxes to be levied from these hard-won planets. The Astartes saw it for what it was, the beginning of bureaucracy creeping in where warriors had once ruled. Orders were orders, but the Crusade fleets began to resent what they saw as a betrayal. And all along, in the background of these events, Lorgar and Erebus slithered between the other Primarchs, seeding ideas like the Warrior Lodges into as many of the legions as possible. The Warrior Lodges were especially useful for this phase of the plan, as they created little subcultures inside the legions who allowed them to operate and spread. During the Great Crusade, these lodges were pivotal for breaking the bonds of brotherhood that kept the Legiones Astartes fighting so efficiently together. And like we said, this was just Erebus and Lorgar taking advantage of an opportunity created by the Emperor. This brotherhood had been steadily breaking down since Monarchia, and possibly even before that. But just in the 40 years between Monarchia and the end of the Ulanor campaign, Conrad Kurz had destroyed his homeworld of Nostramo in rage, Alfarius had been found and was given his legion, officially becoming the last Primarch to be discovered. Lionel Johnson ordered Luther and his wing of Dark Angels into guard duty on Caliban as punishment for the Zariman campaign, seeding the bitterness that would become Luther's rebellion. And most importantly, Primarch 2 and 11 were written out of history. This last one really did a number on the group of Primarchs, especially Leman Russ, whose legion had been tasked to handle the dirty work. From then on, every Primarch was aware of what would happen if they stepped out of line and how their father truly felt about them. They also couldn't trust Russ, the most loyal of them, to stay his hand in a complex situation. They were finally aware that they were tools to be used and discarded, and that uncertainty, doubt, and whispering created an almost perfect opportunity for our villains to make their big move. It was time to turn the War Master. Lorgar was firmly on the side of chaos. He was hardly respected by his brothers. Fulgrim was slowly being corrupted by his lair sword, the Night Haunter was being driven insane by visions of death, and Angron was a barely controlled monster. These four would have no problem turning on the Emperor, but without a true leader, a rebellion with these unstable Primarchs was doomed to failure. The problem was that Horus was still a loyal son. He may have had issues with how his father was acting, but he was never going to rebel without a push, and the opportunity came in the form of the Interrex. A human civilization on the fringes of Imperial space, the Interrex had survived the Long Dark alone and had come out on top. The problem was that they had done so by integrating with Xenos species. First, they relied on the Eldari, who taught them about the dangers of chaos. Then they won a war against a people called the Kinabrak, and absorbed them into their society. They began to mutate slightly, and by the time Horus and his 63rd expedition made contact, the Interrex were a multi-species society spanning 30 systems. While they were peaceful, Imperial law was clear. Hanging out with Xenos was not to be tolerated. But, like we said, Horus had some issues with how his father ran things and wanted to see if these humans were really a threat. So they opened talks and started to get to know each other. But then, because we can't have nice things in the far future, along came Erebus. The first chaplain didn't care at all about what was happening with the Interrex. He had his eyes on a tool that could help him convert Horus, a Kinabrak sword called the Anathame. The weapon appeared semi-sentient and could kill anyone once the user said the real name of their target aloud, even a Primarch. The theft of this weapon caused a rift between the Imperium and the Interrex that forced a war which obviously ended with Horus crushing the Interrex completely, but the real danger was now on its way to a planet with a dark destiny, Davin, the place where the War Master would die. Davin was the 8th world brought into compliance by Horus's 63rd expedition fleet around 944 M30. Its people were a primitive offshoot human society, having spent so much time alone that they had mutated similarly to how Ogryn, Ratlings, or the Votan had. Secretly, these people had already been corrupted by chaos, although they called it by a different name. The expedition forces easily crushed the Davinite resistance, but were so impressed by their warrior culture that they allowed them to reintegrate into human society under a new governor, Eugen Temba, a personal friend of the War Master. Now, stay with us, this is where things get twisty. Davin was already a stronghold of chaos, lots of temples to various forms of the gods, and a populace that was fully on board with the primordial annihilator. So, when Erebus went looking for the perfect place to bait the War Master out into a vulnerable position, Davin was the planet he chose. And he must have chosen it early on, since almost immediately after the 63rd Expedition Fleet moved on, Governor Temba took his soldiers to the moon of Davin to put down what appeared to be a minor rebellion, and was immediately twisted by sorcery into a puppet of the plague god Nurgle. So 60 years after Temba was corrupted, Erebus made a sneaky trip to Davin's moon to give the mutated Temba the Anathame, and returned to Horus with a story about the unthinkable. "Oh no, Horus, it's terrible. Your friend Eugen Temba has rebelled, and he said you stink and that the Emperor's a dummy. We should do something." We're paraphrasing slightly, but in hindsight, it was a really obvious trap. Enraged, Horus and his fleet returned to the now fully corrupted moon of Davin and fought a battle against the horrible reanimated corpses that had once been the soldiers of Governor Temba. Finally having a clear enemy to fight, Horus took to the field himself and dueled a monstrously remade Temba, who was no match for the Primarch, but had just enough chaotic power to manage a small stab to Horus's shoulder with the Anathame. Horus quickly succumbed to the strange technology of the Kinabrak weapon, and in desperation, the leaders of the Sons of Horus Legion took advice from their trusted friend, First Chaplain Erebus. On his suggestion, they traveled to the Serpent Lodge on Davin proper, placing the Primarch into the care of the priesthood there. Inside the secret heart of the temple, Horus lay dying, and Erebus entered his mind using sorcery, showing the War Master visions of a grimdark future and laying the blame squarely on the Emperor's shoulders. The Chaos Gods were peaceful creatures trying to defend their realm from the Emperor's schemes, he said. He showed Horus that the Emperor had made the Primarchs using warp sorcery, which was technically true, and yet another thing the Emperor could have been upfront about if he had been smart. The only attempt to stop Horus from siding with the powers of chaos was his brother Magnus. The Thousand Sons Primarch had seen this coming and tried his best to show Horus that he was being used. The problem was that the War Master's life was on the line here too, and choosing to stay loyal meant death. So the Horus who emerged from the Temple of Davin was not the one who went in. The rebellion had its leader. Earlier we talked about a handful of Primarchs that were 2 steps shy of fist-fighting the Emperor on their own, but the work of recruiting allies truly began at around this point. Lorgar was Team Chaos before Horus was, but aside from him, Angron was probably the easiest for the War Master to recruit. Angron hated the Emperor from the moment he was stolen from his gladiator family, and the Butcher's Nails were slowly killing him while driving him insane, so Horus barely had to say anything, and the Red Angel was convinced to join up. Fulgrim was a little more difficult, but the demon blade he had gotten from Lair had already started breaking him down. The famous Eldari seer Eldred Ulthron had tried to warn Fulgrim about the impending civil war, so when he confronted Horus about it, he was horrified to find that the alien had been telling the truth. However, Fulgrim loved his brother Horus and deeply trusted him. A few solid arguments about how the Emperor was a lying, uncaring monster, plus the demon sword whispering about perfection, and Fulgrim was on board. Mortarion was the last of the original 4 traitors, and admittedly, he was a little harder to convince. He had already started noticing how much of a tyrant the Emperor was, but he also really hated psychic stuff, and all this chaos talk was not something he was into. However, he also trusted and adored Horus, so even though he was disgusted by Lorgar and Fulgrim's new attitude towards the arcane, he agreed that rebellion was the only path forward. Like Angron, the Night Haunter had also never been a fan of the Emperor and was about 2 steps shy of being a renegade by this point anyway. About 20 years before Horus was corrupted on Davin, the Night Lords had discovered a plot by the nobility of their homeworld Nostramo to swap the Legion's recruits with the planet's criminal population. Infuriated, Conrad Kurz fired into the planet's core until it broke apart. So, while he didn't particularly like his brothers, Conrad knew the Loyalists were already thinking about arresting him, and so gladly pledged the Night Lords to the War Master's banner. Meanwhile, Perturabo had been growing more and more bitter with his treatment. He had just finished a costly war against an alien civilization, a conflict that both maimed his legion badly and had no real benefit for the Imperium at large. To make matters worse, when he returned home to Olympia, he found the planet in revolt and decided to decimate the population. He knew the Emperor would have him in chains for his slaughter, but Horus praised him for being practical enough to do what had to be done. Perturabo was also not fond of most of his brothers, but if he would be treated better with Horus, then the Iron Warriors would take up his cause. And finally, we have Alpharius and Omegon. Although it's not clear if anyone knew they were twins, the 20th Legion Primarchs were surprisingly ready to join Horus when he came calling. Later, many would suggest that this was because Horus was the only Primarch that Alpharius seemed to have any sort of positive relationship with, but the real reason happened 3 years before the events of Davin. A group of powerful allies known as the Cabal had reached out to the twins in order to convince them to join Horus. In a vision of the future, they showed the twins that Chaos had invested so much of their power in the War Master and humanity as a whole that if humanity was to be destroyed, the galaxy could be saved from the gods of the warp. They showed that Horus was not fully corrupted, and if he were to win against the Emperor, his guilt and rage would destroy all of humanity within a few short years. But if he lost, then the galaxy would slowly decay into a grimdark future of constant war, while chaos fed on humanity's corruption. Now, we still don't know the exact motives of the Alpha Legion's Primarchs, but they pledged to help the War Master from then on. And it wasn't just fellow Primarchs either. Horus made allies in a bunch of places, but none more important than Kelbor Hal, the Fabricator General of the Mechanicum, who led the Martian priesthood. With his loyalty paid for using stolen advanced technology, Horus had guaranteed that a huge portion of the industrial base of the Imperium was now working for him, including many legions of Titans. Now that he had his secret club of heretics, the War Master needed to make sure all of his forces were on the same page, which meant purging the loyalist elements of the legions who weren't worshipping Chaos yet. And before he could do that, he had to make sure he couldn't be stopped by his loyalist brothers, which began with handling a little spy problem. Remember when Magnus had tried to stop Horus from siding with Chaos? Well, Horus sure did, and the fact that his psychic brother could basically see him anytime he wanted and knew that he planned on taking over the Imperium meant that Horus needed to find a way to take Magnus off the board. Luckily, poor Magnus did that himself. Immediately after Davin, Magnus knew he had to warn his father about what Horus and the gods of chaos were planning, and damn the consequences. The fastest way to reach the Emperor on Terra was with a psychic projection, so even though he had been forbidden to meddle with the warp at the Council of Nicaea, Magnus left his physical body behind and blasted straight for Terra. But then a funny thing happened. While he was traveling through the warp, Magnus noticed a new bit of the Eldari webway that he hadn't seen before that looked like it was more or less a shortcut directly to Terra. It was hard to break into, but thanks to some help from a definitely innocent anonymous voice in his head, Magnus busted a hole in this new webway and coasted all the way to the Imperial Palace, where he learned that it was not an Eldari webway but his father's secret project, a human webway meant to help humanity leave the dangers of the warp forever, and that voice had not been an innocent voice, but a god of chaos, likely Tzeentch, but he didn't know that at the time. Magnus had just blown a hole into this webway that led directly to the Imperial throne room, allowing hordes of demons to pour into the Emperor's safe New Space Highway. Needless to say, Big E was a little upset. It didn't matter that he had never told Magnus about the Chaos Gods or why it was bad to meddle with the warp, or had never told literally any of his sons about the Webway project. All that mattered was Magnus had ruined his work, and he ordered Leman Russ to bring him back to Terra in chains. But Horus hadn't openly rebelled yet, and as War Master, all orders from Terra came to him first, so it was simple to just tell Russ, who was unaware that his brother had turned traitor, that Magnus and his sons were powerful psychers, and the Emperor believed they were too dangerous to be left alive. Prospero must burn. Ever loyal, the Wolf Lord agreed and set out towards Magnus. With that handled, Horus just needed to make sure that the Primarchs who definitely wouldn't join him were busy far away from his fleets, at least the ones big enough to challenge him. Guilliman would never turn against his father, and he had by far the largest legion, so the Ultramarines had to be dealt with. Similarly, the Lion and his Dark Angels would be a major problem, as would Sanguinius and his Blood Angels. Dorn and his legion had thankfully been recalled to Terra to protect the Imperial Palace, so he was safely on the other side of the galaxy. The only other potential problem was Jagatai and his White Scars. Most leaders of the Imperium honestly had no clue which way the Khan would turn, but just to be sure, Horus needed to deal with him too. Guilliman was already on the eastern fringe of the galaxy in his private empire of Ultramar, which was very far from Horus. All the War Master had to do was order him to stay there under the guise of preparing a massive campaign of conquest against the nearby Orc system, and he sent the word bearers to surprise them when the time came. The Dark Angels and Blood Angels he sent off to distant war zones, both of which had been seeded with demonic forces that would try to either corrupt or kill the Lion and Sanguinius. And the White Scars were sent to hunt the Orcs of the Chondak system just in case. In order to make sure they stayed there until Horus had time to see if Jagatai would join him, elements of the Alpha Legion were tasked to keep the White Scars busy for as long as possible, using the Orcs as cover. The last big question mark was Ferrus Manus and his Iron Hands. They were a large enough force to worry about, but Fulgrim was certain that he could get his best friend and favorite brother to side with the War Master. So Horus let him try. Fulgrim left half his legion with Horus to prepare for the events to come and raced off to meet Manus aboard his flagship. Once there, the two retired to Manus' private forge, where Fulgrim tried to convince his brother to betray the Emperor, which was a very big mistake. Ferrus was one of the most loyal Primarchs. There was no way he'd ever betray the Imperium, even if he agreed about his father being terrible. He attacked Fulgrim, but he was blinded by rage, and the Phoenician won the duel, knocking Ferrus out with his own hammer, the one gifted to him by Fulgrim when they first met. And here it would have been so easy to just finish the job, but Fulgrim hadn't fallen completely yet, and so he let his brother live. At this point, you might ask, what about the Salamanders and the Raven Guard? Well, both legions were so much smaller than the others that Horus wanted them singled out for destruction first. So let's do a quick recap here, because that was a lot to cover. Horus had sent the Dark Angels, White Scars, Blood Angels, and Ultramarines off to distant battlefields to keep them out of the way. He had ordered Russ to kill Magnus, ensuring that the terrifying space wolves would be busy elsewhere and that Magnus wouldn't be able to warn anyone. Dorn was stuck on Terra, Vulcan and Corvus Corax were about to be ambushed, and Varys Manus was at the very least unable to act fast enough to stop him. He had the Word Bearers, Night Lords, Iron Warriors, and Alpha Legion on his side and ready to help spring a massive trap. And he had his core spearhead, Mortarion, Angron, Fulgrim, and his own Sons of Horus, all powerful assault legions ready to fight. The only thing he had left to do was purge the loyalists still in his ranks, and so Horus chose a place where he would openly declare rebellion, a place called Eastvan. The Eastvan system was already in rebellion. Chaotic priests and cultists had begun taking the planet back, so the expeditions were told that this was a mission of compliance just like on Davin. They would land with overwhelming force, kill the traitors, and install a new governor loyal to the Emperor, or at least that was the cover story. The first wave was entirely drawn from the loyalist elements of the Sons of Horus, World Eaters, Emperor's Children, and Death Guard. Those Marines who were least likely to go along with betraying the Emperor. And then, with the now famous declaration of "Let the Galaxy Burn," Horus bombed the planet with forbidden virus weapons, destroying almost every living thing on Eastvan 3. However, an operation this complex was bound to have some holes in the planning, and there were inevitably some loyalists left in orbit with the fleet. One of which, an Emperor's Children captain named Saul Tarvitz, noticed the bombs being loaded and understood what was about to happen. He managed to steal a Thunderhawk and dove towards the planet to warn his comrades to seek cover. Along the way, he alerted a trusted friend, Nathaniel Garro of the Death Guard, who was in command of a frigate called the Eisenstein. Garro was a Terran-born Astartes, and he trusted Saul even though his story was insane. The War Master turning traitor was unthinkable at the point, but he and Saul had formed a strong bond during many campaigns together, and once the bombing started, the truth was obvious. Garro decided to slip past the traitor fleet and deliver a warning to Terra itself, while Saul continued to the planet's surface to help lead the defense. Now, we will see Garro again, but unfortunately, Tarvitz ends his story here. Although his warning came just in time to save many loyal Astartes from the bombs, Tarvitz and the other loyalists would not survive the final traitor assaults, but he made sure they paid for it with a drawn-out fight that Horus had not planned for. However, now that he could be certain his core force was entirely loyal to him, Horus began planning the ambush we mentioned earlier. It hadn't been the plan to reveal themselves as traitors quite this early, but the War Master was prepared anyway, and alerted his allies who hadn't yet openly defied the Emperor to be ready for the second part of their Eastvan plot. All they had to do was pretend to be loyal for just a little bit longer. After a series of misadventures, the Einstein arrives at Luna with Captain Garro delivering the news of Horus, Mortarion, Fulgrim, and Angron's betrayal. It was, thankfully, still 005 M31, the same year they had escaped Eastvan 3, but they hadn't lost too much time, and after some checking to make sure Garro and his men weren't secret traitors feeding them false information, Rogel Dorn issued orders for an immediate retribution action. The Emperor was slightly busy holding back a tide of demons that had somehow flooded into the throne room, so Dorn was officially in charge of the Imperium's armies, and doing a quick check of his forces, he had the Iron Hands, Salamanders, Raven Guard, Iron Warriors, Night Lords, Alpha Legion, and elements of the Word Bearers, as well as his own Imperial Fists, although they would be slower to arrive than the others thanks to their position on Terra. Communication with the Ultramarines, Dark Angels, Blood Angels, Space Wolves, and White Scars was cut off by some convenient warp storm activity that had just popped up, so those legions couldn't even get word that Horus had rebelled. On the traitor side, Horus had ordered Fulgrim to prepare Eastvan 5 for the coming battle. The little planetoid on the edge of the system would be perfect for the ambush, plus the traitors had sort of wrecked Eastvan 3. But within short order, fortifications were raised, and the 4 openly traitorous legions dug in and waited. Meanwhile, the Revenge Force led by Ferrus Manus was blazing towards the system. Manus was so angry that he had chosen to rush ahead of the bulk of his own fleet with the ships he had that were still functional after Fulgrim's betrayal. This meant that the Iron Hands had only their most elite divisions to drop, making their force not much larger than what the Salamanders or the Raven Guard could field. But luckily, they had the Alpha Legion, Word Bearers, Night Lords, and Iron Warriors to back them up, so everything would be fine, right? Tried to contain your shock people, but everything was not fine. The hidden traitors in the Revenge Force had lagged behind, claiming warp storm interference or mechanical issues, leaving the 3 Loyalist legions to land first, against the better judgment of some of the cooler heads among their leadership. But Ferrus Manus was too angry to wait, and he charged to the surface via drop pod, smashing as close to the traitor line as he could before the orbital guns had even cooled from the preliminary bombardment. At first, the battle was going well for the Loyalists. Manus's rage more than made up for the difference in numbers, and for some reason, a couple of the traitor Primarchs, notably Fulgrim and Horus, hadn't yet shown themselves. Because of this, the Loyalist legions made huge gains into traitor-held areas. Vulcan's troops melted their assigned flanks with so much fire that they forced even the Death Guard back. Corax led lightning assaults against the World Eaters' positions, sniping and cutting Angron's men before melting back and frustrating any countercharges. And Ferrus Manus was leading a headlong charge right down the center, with his elite Morlock Terminators carving a path through the Sons of Horus and Emperor's children, looking for any sign of his traitorous brothers. The traitor forces did outnumber them, however, and they slowly ground the initial assault to a standstill. But then, about 3 hours into the fighting, the Loyalist reinforcements arrived. Landing in the safe drop site their brother legions had so generously prepared for them, the Night Lords and Alpha Legion moved to support the flanks, the Iron Warriors took the high ground at the drop site and began setting up prefabricated defenses, which the Word Bearers took position on. Seeing that the Imperium's forces had more than doubled, the traitors began a fighting retreat. Even Angron started moving back toward the core of his force, which should have been a clue that something was very wrong. For their part, Corax and Vulcan suggested that the 3 legions from the first wave should take full advantage of the lull in fighting and fall back to the drop zone and gather fresh supplies before joining their reinforcements for the final push, but Ferrus was not having it. He had just found Fulgrim's position and was stomping towards it, completely oblivious to the danger. The other 2 headed back to the Loyalist lines, maybe hoping Ferrus would come to his senses, or maybe because they had taken heavy losses in those first 3 hours and just couldn't support their brother. We'll never know. As the Raven Guard and the Salamanders got to within 100 meters of the newly fortified Loyalist lines, the Vox went dead, and a flare went up from the traitor command post, and the second wave opened fire on the first. Some reports say that the forward elements of the Raven Guard got close enough to start calling out to friends among the Word-Bearer lines by name, underscoring the tragedy to come in the next few moments as the Salamanders and Raven Guard were shot to pieces. Night Lord gunships began bombing runs on the scattering Loyalists, Alpha Legion apothecary stations revealed themselves as forward assault elements, and of course, the Iron Warriors brought lots of artillery. Completely thrown into disarray, Corax took his men and left, ordering a full retreat. He would make it out with a fraction of his troops, executing hit-and-run maneuvers against the traitors for the next couple of weeks before being rescued. Vulcan would choose to stay, and would eventually be captured by Conrad Kurz for his trouble. Meanwhile, Ferrus and his Iron Hands refused to retreat in the face of these new developments. Fulgrim had stepped into his path, inviting a duel, and he was not going to let this opportunity for revenge slip away. The fight was titanic and tragic in equal measures. Ferrus fought with the sort of anger that comes from a deep betrayal, and Fulgrim, though a better fencer on paper, didn't have the heart to kill his brother, who he still loved. But the decision was made for him when Fulgrim gave into the whispers of his demonic blade and allowed the creature inside to possess him, who then promptly cut the head off Ferrus's shoulders. The death of the Iron Hands Primarch signaled the end of the battle. The traitors had won an overwhelming victory and crippled 3 whole Loyalist legions while taking comparatively few losses themselves. With all the pieces in place and the road to Terra theirs for the taking, Horus set his gaze on the Sol system. The campaign from Eastvan to Terra would be one of the most colossal wars ever fought, sweeping across too many star systems to name in this discussion. As we said earlier, many of these battles could fill a video on their own, so if we're going to get to the finale of this heresy, here is where we're going to have to jump around a bit. First, let's talk about what the other Loyalists had been doing, because Several of them were so cut off from Terra that they didn't even know about the War Master's treachery. The Blood Angels had been sent to the Cygnus system to put down an uprising and arrived in 006 M31 to find an army of demons alongside traitor wordbearers. Remember that at this time, demons were still considered superstition, so imagine the shock of these Astartes pulling up to an entire horde of these things. Regardless, even though the demons would do their best to try and corrupt and then, when that didn't work, kill Sanguinius, he and the Blood Angels would be victorious. This campaign was also the first ever open appearance of the Red Thirst, the gene seed flaw that would become the hallmark of the Legion. In that same year, an Imperial Fists strike force, which included elements of the Space Wolves, Custodes, and Loyalist Mechanicum elements, blockaded and conquered the War Master's homeworld of Chthonia. The traitors knew they couldn't hold it, so instead they sabotaged the planet's industry and went underground to fight a guerrilla war until reinforcements could arrive. Around that same time, the Dark Angels were made aware of the heresy when a stray Sons of Horus fleet made a surprise attack on an installation of theirs in the Rangda system to the galactic north of their main expedition fleet. And not long after that, Horus sent the Night Lords to tie up the Lion's fleets with an extended running battle across the eastern fringe, which worked very well, keeping the Dark Angels occupied for about 2 years. Back in the Sol system, the Mechanicus were having a small civil war called the Schism of Mars. On one side, Fabricator General Kelbor Hal and a whole bunch of tech adepts who were really tired of not being allowed to play with the cool forbidden technologies. And on the other hand were the adepts who still believed that the Emperor was the Omnissiah and a sizable force of Imperial Fists and Custodes. Unfortunately for the Loyalists, the lure of being able to study technology freely was too great, and the overwhelming traitor forces won, renaming themselves the Dark Mechanicum and forcing the Imperial forces to blockade Mars. Not long after that, at the very beginning of 007 M31, Corax, having been rescued from Eastvan by a relief fleet, makes his way to Terra in order to beg his father for help to speed up the process of making new Astartes for his badly mauled Legion. Big E was still using most of his brainpower holding back demons in the throne room, but he spared a thought or two for Corax and showed him where to get some gene tech to do just that, which Omegon then promptly sabotaged and stole. That will happen a lot in this war. But probably the biggest event to happen during this year would be the betrayal at Calth. If you recall, the Ultramarines had been told by Horus to gather their forces in preparation for a campaign against the Orcs that was totally real. Trust him, you guys. They had also been cut off from Terra by some convenient warp storms and had no idea about the heresy unfolding. And so, when the bulk of the Wordbearers Legion arrived at the muster point in orbit of Calth, they thought everything was going to plan, and then the Wordbearers opened fire. The tightly packed Ultramarines ships didn't stand a chance, and a huge portion of the Legion was sent falling to the planet. Our favorite bad guy Erebus used this as a massive sacrifice to the Dark Gods and created the Ruin Storm, a massive warp storm designed by Lorgar to not only cut off communication to the wider Imperium, but also to stop travel outside the Eastern Fringe for anyone not allied to the Dark Powers. This meant that the Dark Angels, Blood Angels, and Ultramarines were stuck there until the storm weakened, and with some of the strongest legions safely fenced off, the traitor legions were able to completely run rampant. It also tied up Lorgar and his legion while he kept feeding the Ruin Storm with sacrifices to keep it strong, but one legion mostly tied up in one area is a way better situation than what the Loyalists were having to deal with. Plus, no one really liked Lorgar anyway. On the other side of the Ruin Storm, most of the fighting was being done by the Imperial Fists, the now heavily wounded Space Wolves Legion, and scattered warbands made up of the remnants of the Salamanders, Raven Guard, and Iron Hands, calling themselves the Shattered Legions. The Space Wolves had taken unexpectedly heavy losses on Prospero while gutting the Thousand Suns, and were immediately ambushed by a sizable Alpha Legion force after that at the Battle of Alaxis Nebula in 007 M31. This did not stop them from engaging the traitors, but it certainly made them more cautious, which was a win in the traitors' books. Dorn, meanwhile, had orders to protect the Sol system, and as we mentioned earlier, had his hands full with the Dark Mechanicum and so could only send smaller forces out to help. A surprising amount of work was reportedly done by the Shattered Legions, who made the most of their smaller armies by using hit-and-run disruption attacks during much of this period. The only other big question mark during this time was Jaghatai Khan and his White Scars. To remind you all, the 5th Legion had been sent off by Horus to the Chondak system to fight some orcs, and the Alpha Legion had been quietly disrupting them to make the whole thing take longer, and of course they were not able to communicate with Terra because of some mechanical failures that, as you might expect, had been caused by the Alpha Legion, who had blockaded the system in secret. To make matters worse, Horus knew that at some point Jaghatai would learn about the heresy, and since he still didn't know which way the Khan would swing, he told his brother that Russ had turned traitor and had attacked the Thousand Sons on Prospero. So when Leman Russ finally got a message through to his brother during the Battle of Alaxis Nebula we mentioned earlier, Jaghatai had no clue who was telling the truth, but he did know how to find out. Gathering his legion, the Khan broke through the blockade and made for Prospero, where he had to fight through the ghosts of dead Thousand Sons legionnaires before being confronted by a shard of his brother Magnus. The Psychic Primarch had lost his physical body when he fought Leman Russ, making a desperate jump into the warp with as many of his sons as he could take. This broke Magnus into 5 separate shards representing various parts of his personality, one of which was now begging Jaghatai to take a side in this war. After their conversation, the Death Guard arrived and Mortarion went down to try and convince the Khan to join Horus, while traitor White Scars in orbit tried to take control of the fleet. This ultimately failed, and Jaghatai, who was grumpy at being manipulated by this point, declared himself a loyal son of the Emperor and forced Mortarion to retreat after a vicious battle. From there, the White Scars decided to make for Terra, but were kept back the next 4 years as various enemy fleets and warp storms attempted to slow them down. But they would eventually make it through a webway portal, ending up in orbit around Terra in 011 M31. All in all, the Loyalists were not in a good place, but all was not well between the traitor Primarchs either, and the very same things that made them turn on the Emperor were also causing them to lose cohesion and turn on each other slowly. One of the first real problems was that, aside from the 4 legions who were at Eastvan 3, none of the other legions had purged the Loyalists from their ranks. This wasn't really a problem for the Wordbearers, who had all been heretics before anyone else. It wasn't a big deal for the Night Lords, whose forces were mostly made up of criminals who knew the Imperium didn't want them, so the few, if any, Loyalists either quietly slipped away or kept their mouths shut. But for the Alpha Legion and the Iron Warriors, this became a huge problem. Well, at least it definitely was for the Iron Warriors. We'll get to the confusing mess with the Alpha Legion in a minute. But throughout the heresy, loyalist groups of the Iron Warriors just kept popping up to delay the traitors whenever they could least afford it. For instance, the fortress of Schadenhold was besieged by the traitors in 006 M31, and the loyalist Iron Warriors held out for 366 days against a huge force, even destroying an Emperor-class Titan before detonating some prepared explosives as a final act of defiance. And like we said, the Alpha Legion was seemingly a mess. They had been tasked with talking to Jaghatai to convince him to join Horus, since Alpharius and Jaghatai were both philosophical people with the ability to talk circles around any arguments, but instead, they stalled them until messages from Leman Russ and Dorn got to the system and even openly attacked the White Scars without even trying to convince them to defect, making Jaghatai much more likely to side with the Emperor. Little things like this kept happening throughout the heresy, where the Alpha Legion would make mistakes that weren't typical of the Legion, and which benefited the Imperium somehow. But they were also clearly fighting for Horus, ambushing Russ and his wolves, ambushing the Raven Guard. They did a lot of ambushing. But these little moments make us think that the Alpha Legion may have joined Horus to weaken him from the inside, or one of the twins wasn't actually convinced to turn traitor and was working against the other. Alpharius himself might have been killed in 010 M31 in a fight with Dorn on Pluto, but we can't be sure. We do know that the confusion definitely caused some big issues for the traitors as a whole. Then there was the drama between the Primarchs themselves. One of the clearest examples happened in early 007 M31, where Perturabo and Fulgrim dove into the Eye of Terror looking for an artifact that would give them some sort of power boost. And that's vague on purpose, because Fulgrim actually planned on sacrificing Perturabo to become a demon prince. And while he failed to kill his brother, Fulgrim did succeed and was transformed into a demon of Slanesh, completing his journey into darkness. Perturabo and his forces meanwhile kept ignoring orders to go off and do their own thing. As it turned out, Horus also kept using the Iron Warriors for garrison and siege duties, and they were done with getting given all the worst assignments, wandering off whenever they caught wind of resources or artifacts that would benefit them. Surprising no one, Lorgar had his own agenda the entire time, which seemed to just be bring more chaos into the galaxy at any cost. Most of the time, this benefited his brothers, like when he conducted an entire campaign to transform Angron into a demon prince of Khorne, saving his life from the butcher's nails that were slowly killing him. Or when he dove into the Eye of Terror to pull Fulgrim back to the war he had left behind when he became a demon prince himself. But he also got himself banished to the Eye of Terror for attempting a coup against Horus while the War Master was injured from a duel with Leman Russ in 012 M31. Horus himself was, as you can imagine, frustrated. He often complained that he didn't have more loyal and talented generals like Varys Manus, Guilliman, or Sanguinius, and aside from the sorry state of his traitorous brothers, this was actually down to the fact that he still didn't have full confidence that he was doing the right thing. Even after he dove into the warp portal on Molech to gain the same power the Emperor won by tricking the Chaos Gods before starting his Primarch project, Horus was still deeply uncertain while he wasn't under the effects of the warp corruption. He knew the Emperor had to be stopped, but everywhere he looked, his rebel forces were falling into greed and infighting. By comparison, his loyalist brothers were surviving insane pressure and reaching out to each other to organize and push back. Even trapped behind the Ruinstorm, unable to know if the Imperium was even still standing, Guilliman, Sanguinius, and Lionel Johnson created a new Imperium to keep the dream alive and push back against chaos. They even disbanded this new government willingly once the Ruinstorm finally collapsed in 011 M31, which was a display of duty and commitment that Horus would never get from most of his brothers. Angron, especially after his transformation, was very difficult to control and required a lot of resources to keep focused on the war effort. Konrad Curze kept slipping in and out of sanity and had been captured by the Loyalists at one point before escaping. We already talked about the issues with Alfaris and Omegon, and Magnus was only there because he had no other choice. Mortarion was mostly an asset, but he refused to do anything without getting orders directly from Horus, which slowed things down sometimes, but to be fair, I wouldn't have trusted any of his allies either. The real problems with the Death Guard were that only some of its members were worshippers of chaos. Like we said, Mortarion really hated anything to do with the war. But his first captain, Callus Typhon, was looking to change that, and he had a scheme to force his Primarch to see the warp light. In late 013 M31, the traitors had gathered on Beta Garmin and were getting ready to jump to the Sol System for the final showdown. Typhon convinced his Primarch to travel there aboard his battle barge, and then framed his navigators as being spies for the Emperor's chief advisor, Malcador the Sigillite. After killing them, the Death Guard fleet was marooned in the warp where Nurgle began his work. The Destroyer Plague tore through his Astartes, causing agony. After being infected himself, Mortarion confronted Typhon, killing him, but Typhon was a champion of the Plague Father and was brought back to life over and over again. Realizing he was defeated, Mortarion heard Nurgle tell him that he could either stay here with his men forever, rotting and sick, or he could pledge himself to chaos and gain the power to bring down the Emperor. Mortarion wanted to save his men, and he wanted to bring down the Tyrant of Terra, and so, reluctantly, he agreed. And when the Death Guard finally appeared in the Sol System, Mortarion was a full demon prince, and the Death Guard were nearly unkillable. The year was 014 M31, and the end of the heresy was in sight. The Solar War, as it was called, had actually started way back in 010 M31, with the Alpha Legion joining the Dark Mechanicus in causing problems for Rogal Dorn's forces in the Sol System. 20th Legion was adept at sabotage, and the amount of times they were able to destroy infrastructure around Terra itself during this period was truly mind-boggling. Dorn wasn't particularly well suited to taking on the slippery Alpha Legion, but he kept the Sol System mostly under control, even killing Alfarius early in the conflict. Maybe. Look, he killed someone named Alfarius who definitely seemed to be a Primarch, but Alfarius later gave a map of the Sol System's defenses to Horus personally, so it looks like his death was a ruse. What we do know is that it didn't even make the Alpha Legion flinch, and they kept up the pressure until their allies started arriving 4 years later. The traitors had won a titanic victory on Beta Garmin, which had forced the Loyalists back and finally allowed the heretics a clear route to the Sol system. The full armada jumped in at the furthest warp gates in the system near Pluto and Uranus, and began sweeping aside Imperial opposition. Dorn had set up 5 spheres of void defenses made up of orbital platforms and naval flotillas, and one by one, the War Master's fleet destroyed them all. Horus had the numbers, he had the resources, and he had sorcery all aiding him. He took the outer defenses, then moved inwards, breaking the blockade of Mars and assaulting the defense ring of Luna. Using sorcery, Ahriman of the Thousand Suns, along with a Wordbearer's force, used a rare alignment of Halley's Comet to open a huge warp tear that blotted out the sun, allowing for the full World Eaters, Emperor's Children, and the remaining Thousand Suns fleets to appear right above the moon. Similar plots and gambits were used in fighting all across the solar system, with one such scheme even managing to disable the Imperial Fist's mighty starfort, the Phalanx, by flooding it with demons using a refugee who had been unknowingly corrupted years before. All of this ended with the Sol system firmly in the grasp of the traitors, who now gathered in Terran orbit for the final assault. Horus had brought everything he had. We don't have many accounts of the numbers, but we'll add them where we can here. Perturabo leading his Iron Warriors, the Demon Princes Magnus, Fulgrim, Angron, and Mortarion, along with the full weight of the Thousand Suns, 9,000 strong, alongside a staggering 100,000 Emperor's Children, and every member of the World Eaters and Death Guard. 5,000 Wordbearers, led by Zardu Layak with First Chaplain Erebus to back him up, since Lorgar was still in timeout in the warp, and the Night Lords led by Captain Gendor Skravok, because, we're not kidding you, Conrad had been frozen in a stasis capsule by Sanguinius and shot into open space while en route to Terra. We know Sanguinius meant it to be a kindness of sorts to keep Kurz away from the assassin he had seen in his visions, but that is a really funny reason for why the Night Hunter wasn't at the Siege of Terra. The traitors were also joined by the now fully reunited Dark Mechanicus, along with its Titan legions, as well as Imperial Army regiments, and of course, a massive horde of demons. By comparison, the Loyalist forces seem very outnumbered. Besides the Ultramarines and Space Wolves not being able to make it in time, the bulk of the Dark Angels hadn't been able to get through the Ruinstorm and had decided to go around destroying the Traitors' Legion's home worlds, succeeding in raising Chemos of the Emperor's Children, Nucaria belonging to the World Eaters, and Barbarous, home of the Death Guard. Incidentally, the Lion choosing to do this instead of blazing towards Terra is the source of the old Dark Angels are secret heretics jokes. However, we know that that's not true nowadays, and there was already a sizable contingent of Dark Angels under Lord Commander Corswain that were on Terra for the siege, a reported 10,000 Marines. Aside from them, there were 3 entire legions left over, the Imperial Fists, the Blood Angels, and the White Scars, all with their Primarchs. Vulcan was there as well, but he was assigned to guard the Golden Throne and the Webway portal underneath it. More on that later. The Shattered Legions were present too, although we're not sure how many of the scattered warbands of Salamanders, Raven Guard, and Iron Hands managed to get to Sol before the fighting started. There was, of course, a truly insane number of Imperial Army regiments. We are talking billions of troops to help bulk out those numbers, as well as the newly reformed Loyalist Mechanicum and the remains of the Loyalist Titan Legions and Knight Houses that came with them. Again, very little numbers are available to us here, but we know that the Titan Legion Ignatum had 55 engines ready to fight, while Legio Ataris had just one lonely boy out there. It was rough for the Loyalist Titan Legions. And finally, there were the Sisters of Silence and the 1,000 Custodian Guard led by Captain General Constantin Valdor, each and every one of whom was a legendary hero in their own right. With the quality of these forces and the powerful defenses and sorceress wards of the Imperial Palace to back them up, the field was relatively even at the start of the siege, which was a miracle if you remember how badly things started for the Loyalists way back at Isstvan III. Now, out of every battle in the Horus Heresy, the Siege of Terra is the one that most deserves its own video, but we will cover the major points here. The very first shot of the siege was an orbital shell fired from Horus's flagship and was aimed at the Emperor's personal quarters. It didn't hit, there was far too many defense guns and shields for that, but it was a symbolic gesture that led into a sustained barrage of shells and orbital lasers that went on for days and was meant to soften the defenses enough to find a weak point where the traitors could begin landing. The siege plan written up by Perturabo was complex and unrelenting. No one knew siegecraft like the Iron Warrior's Primarch, and he had a grudge to settle with Dorn, who had designed the defenses of the Imperial Palace. This is what the traitors needed him for, since the barriers, shields, and especially the psychic wards placed around the palace meant that sorcery or trickery were not going to open a way in for the traitors the way that Ahriman and his comet had earlier. None of the demons, including the demon primarchs of course, could set foot on the battlefield until those shields were cracked. And cracks did slowly start to form. At first, only small aircraft could make it in for short bombing runs, but eventually, transports could land near the Helios Gate, allowing the traitors to start landing troops, which of course started with the mortal forces they had brought with them to soften up the loyalists. Guardsmen sworn to Horus landed alongside mutated cultists, while orbital bombardment and bombing runs continued. This is actually when the Death Guard finally popped out of the warp, newly sworn to Nurgle and ready to be the first Astartes on the ground. The Death Guard assault made space for the Dark Mechanicus to deploy their arcane siege engines that would begin to lower the shields and psychic wards of the palace. Jagatai and Sanguinius both led small charges out from their gates to disrupt the traitors, but it was more to gain information and destroy some key fortifications than it was a real attack. The shields did eventually come down, however, and although the Emperor was able to keep an anti-warp barrier active from the Golden Throne, demons and demon primarchs were finally able to make it to the surface of Terra. Angron was literally shot out of a ship in orbit and just fell to the ground like the angriest meteor you've ever seen. Now, fully powered by the gods of chaos, Horus began assaulting the Emperor's barrier with his own psychic might, alongside Magnus, who was searching for a breach in the webway he could exploit on purpose this time. But the traitors were already starting to fall apart. They had the numbers, of course, but they all had different motives, and especially Fulgrim and Angron were impossible to control. The Emperor's children, for instance, despite having some of the largest numbers of Marines available, had started wandering around Terra taking captives for their own perverse uses instead of fighting at the palace. Angron just stomped around the battlefield wherever his rage took him, which wasn't always where he was most needed. Thankfully, Mortarion seemed to still be in control of himself, and he attacked the Lion's Gate spaceport. The fighting was insanity. Everywhere, great heroes on both sides dueled each other. Massive titans blew holes in fortifications kilometers across. Millions died in an instant from explosions bigger than anything that had ever been seen on Terra. Magnus finally found a way into the palace by throwing a titan into the walls and detonating it. He slipped through the Emperor's shields using his own psychic powers and the fact that he hadn't yet fully ascended to demonhood. But after confronting the Emperor on the Golden Throne and being soundly beaten by an angry Vulcan, he finally gave himself fully to Tzeentch, becoming a demon and letting the Emperor's wards push him outside before he was killed. Perturabo, meanwhile, was just about ready to quit. Half the traitor army wasn't following his careful plans and were mostly dying because of it. The disorganized hordes that had once been disciplined Astartes and Imperial army groups, now a teeming mass of demons and mutants. The whole thing disgusted him. Finally, when Horus ordered that Perturabo break his army up and sprinkle them across the battlefield to hold key positions, he cracked and ordered a retreat of his forces. If he was going to be treated exactly like the Emperor had treated him, then he was just going to leave. In the vacuum, the Death Guard took over as the Dark Mechanicus sent in waves of zombie titans that had been raised back onto their feet with sorcery and hordes of demon engines. The Astronomicon had gone down at some point during the fighting, infected by a greater demon, but was retaken by the Dark Angels, who desperately held the device safe from the traitors while trying to relight the beacon. Knowing that they had to retake the spaceport in case Guilliman was able to show up and land troops, Jagatai charged out towards the Death Guard and fought Mortarion. He was badly wounded by his now demonic brother, but he succeeded in sending him back to the warp by cutting off his head. That is 2 headless Primarchs for those keeping track at home. Magnus had found his way into the webway finally, and Vulcan was forced to enter the portal and fight his brother again. Sanguinius, meanwhile, was on a tear, killing anything he came across. Titans, demons, he even managed to kill his brother Angron, sending him back to the warp after an aerial duel that saw both Primarchs score deep wounds on each other. At almost the exact same moment that Angron was defeated, Vulcan managed to beat Magnus in the webway and banish him as well, which made the traitor line more or less collapse just as they were about to breach the Great Eternity Gate that led to the heart of the palace. And now that the Loyalists had control of the spaceport again, they switched back on the anti-orbital defenses, shredding the traitor armada above them. After months of siege, the traitor advance was finally slowing to a crawl, just as word came that Guilliman and his massive fleet of fresh Ultramarines reinforcements was barely a week away. For Horus, it was now or never. Horus had become a conduit for pure chaotic energy in an attempt to become the fifth Chaos God, a being known as the Dark King, the god of conquest, which was foretold to come from humanity in the same way that Slaanesh had come from the Eldari. Horus believed he was to become this god, and as time and space began to bend around his ship, threatening to pull all of Terra into the warp, cultists across the planet began chanting for the Dark King. It was now that Horus knew he had to act, before Guilliman arrived and swept the remaining traitor forces aside. He needed to draw his father out and kill him. So to a shocked bridge crew, he ordered that the shields of his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, be lowered. Immediately, the change was noticed far below in the palace by Malcador, the Emperor's closest friend and advisor. He rushed to inform the Master of Mankind, who was still struggling to hold back the waves of demons attempting to pour out of the open webway portal. The Emperor knew there was only one choice. He had to face his favorite son. After some debate, he chose Sanguinius, Dorn, and Valdor alongside elites from the Blood Angels and Imperial Fists, as well as 2 companies of the Custodian Guard to come with him. A bold teleport strike directly onto the Vengeful Spirit was the best way in, even though everyone knew it was a trap. Vulcan would stay and defend the portal, but he couldn't hope to hold it without a powerful Psyker on the Golden Throne. That would have been Magnus's job, but he was now drifting in the warp, a traitor. So Malcador volunteered, knowing he could never survive it. He was a perpetual like the Emperor, but he was much less durable, and the psychic strain would eventually tear his soul apart. But this was the only option they had. Malcador the Sigillite climbed the stairs to the throne, and Malcador the hero said goodbye to his friend as he sat down and activated it. The assault force ready, the sacrifices made, the Emperor headed to the teleportarium. He had a son to kill. Immediately, something was wrong. The assault force had been scattered across the ship, but worse than that, the Emperor discovered that Horus had been holding back his power to let him think he could win. The War Master had found the portal on Molech and was filled with the same power as the Emperor now, a true match for him by almost every measure. The interior of the Vengeful Spirit had been transformed by illusions, and the Loyalists found themselves in several strange places. The Emperor and his custodian bodyguard were in a hellish landscape. Valdor and his men were in a dark vault of some sort, surrounded by demons. Dorn was in some sort of endless desert, feeling centuries go by in minutes. Sanguinius was the only one who had landed somewhere half normal, and he was immediately attacked by demons and Sons of Horus squads. Horus's power was growing, and the ship began to meld with parts of Terra and places within the warp, and it wasn't an illusion. It was a true blending of realities, which allowed more traitors and warp creatures to spill into the palace past the almost non-existent defenses. However, even now, it seemed that Horus still wanted to turn his brother Sanguinius to his side. Whether from love or hubris, we'll never know. Sanguinius had no intention of joining him, of course, and fought more viciously than he ever had. The Blood Angels Primarch had seen visions of this moment and knew he would be killed, but he tried anyway, even managing to wound Horus a little, despite the War Master being so powerful that it didn't really affect him. Horus almost casually killed the Angel of Baal, and on the planet below, every Blood Angel went insane as the death visions of their father overrode their sanity. The Black Rage had been born. Meanwhile, Dorn and Valdor were desperately cutting their way free of the insanity of the Vengeful Spirit and making their way slowly to where they knew the Emperor and Horus would be, hoping they weren't too late. Knowing that he might not be able to beat Horus in this state, the Emperor tried something desperate. He began absorbing massive amounts of warp energy to gain power. It was a decent plan in the sense that it would have given the Emperor the power he needed, but it was too much. The surge of warp energy killed the last of his custodian guard, and he took the form of a sphere of obsidian wreathed in lightning. He passed through realms of the warp, demons fleeing from him as the truth was revealed. It wasn't Horus who was destined to become the fifth god of chaos. It was the Emperor. It's here that we see a curious group of perpetuals and unlikely heroes, including an old friend of the Emperor's named Olanius Person, show up seemingly out of nowhere. Person was able to reconnect with his old friend and remind him that victory meant nothing if he lost his own humanity along the way. It was an argument that the Emperor agreed with so strongly that even in his partially corrupted state, he came to his senses and let that power go in a burst of psychic energy that calmed the warp almost everywhere, except Horus's throne room. If the Emperor would defeat his son, he was going to do it as the ruler of humanity, not a horrible warp abomination. The Perpetual Squad sticks with him for the last of this fight, but honestly, they don't do much except give the Emperor that anathema blade that had originally killed Horus. Seeing Sanguinius dead and strung up in the throne room was truly the last straw. He ignored Horus's taunts and addressed the Chaos Gods directly, telling them that he had killed his son and to stand down. That obviously wasn't going to happen, and the War Master began the duel by shooting lightning at his father. The battle was insanity, being fought in the metaphorical as much as the physical. Each of them would deal horrible blows to the other only to have it instantly healed. They fought across time and space as realities broke under their raw power. They attacked each other in their own memories, and then their fight became a card game instead of a high-powered duel. It must have looked like nonsense from the outside. Powered by all four of the Dark Gods, Horus overpowered his father in this metaphysical arena and dragged him to a nearby throne and literally nailed him to it. It's here that a lone custodian and Olanius Person confront Horus to give just one more moment for the Emperor to break free. Horus kills them both, of course, but it was just enough time and the battle continued. However, Horus didn't know it was still happening. Using the last bit of strength he had, the Emperor fell back on some of his old trickery and created an illusion of himself still nailed to the throne, and then made another illusion of a captain of the Sons of Horus, Garviel Loken, to try and talk Horus down. Horus had loved Loken as one of his favorite sons, and the illusion Loken begged the War Master to see that he was a slave to chaos, and there was still time to give up this corrupted power. That last little bit of Horus's self-doubt won for just a moment, and he gave up the extra power he had been given. Demons and gods tried to warn him, but it was too late. The illusion was revealed, and the fight continued in the physical realm, with a greatly weakened Emperor facing off against his son one last time. Even without his power, Horus was strong enough to do some serious damage. He took the Emperor's eye, wrecked one of his arms, crushed his spine, and even burned off his hair. But at that moment back on the surface, the Dark Angels managed to relight the Astronomican, and with the extra burst of psychic power, the Emperor grabbed hold of Horus's head and directed the powerful psychic lighthouse to pour into the War Master's brain. Reeling from the pain and briefly abandoned by the Chaos Gods for being foolish enough to reject their power, Horus begged his father to kill him before Chaos took him again. There was only a brief hesitation before the Emperor picked up the anathema, spoke Horus's name, and shoved it into his son's chest with all his remaining power. Horus Lupercal, War Master, favored son of the Master of Mankind, was obliterated in body and soul. And with that, the Emperor collapsed. Dorn and Valdor arrived not long after to the shocking scene, and thinking the Emperor to be dead, collected him, Sanguinius, and the skull of Ferrus Manus, which Horus had kept nearby, before heading back to the surface. The only clue that the Lord of Humanity was still barely alive came from a single card of the Emperor's Tarot, a card from the deck he and Horus had played with. Somehow it had survived the powerful battle and lay next to his body, showing the throne. The meaning was obvious, and the group rushed to get him to the palace. Meanwhile, the death of Horus had completely nullified the power of the warp in the whole solar system. Every remaining demon was banished, and the defenders rallied, attacking the retreating traitor forces in a full rout. Isolated pockets would cause problems on Terra for years afterwards, but right now, they were running. And right on cue, the Ultramarines arrived to mop up. Back in the throne room, the dust that had once been Malcador was cleaned off the throne, and the broken body of the Emperor put in its place. His weakened power fueled the Astronomican and proved that he was still alive, sort of. Regardless, the Emperor would remain there for over 10,000 years. And just as the Cabal had shown Alpharius and Omegon in their vision way back at the very beginning of this journey, the Imperium would limp onwards, stagnating and keeping chaos alive, while humanity fell deeper and deeper into their grim, dark future. Inside the sweeping story of the tragic fall of the Imperium, there are countless other tales, each of which could fill a video and does fill a whole library of books. There is so much more to discuss about this conflict that we just didn't have time for. What was the Emperor actually doing? Who were these Perpetuals, the Cabal, and the various agents all working behind the scenes to stop the plans of chaos? How many schemes was Erebus trying to work through? There are truly just far too many of these unanswered questions for us to pick, so please, if you've stayed with us long enough to get here, let us know in the comments what stories you'd like us to dive into. And if you want to go further and help us keep these stories alive, consider joining the chapter of More Lore by becoming a member. Initiates keep the archives running, Battle Brothers get early access to every chronicle, and our chapter masters, their names are etched into the records itself. However you support us, be it memberships or an easy like and subscribe, every interaction is just one more way for you to support More Lore.